Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to show you some fingering options for the major scale 1 chords that we went over in the last lesson. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free eGuide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this eGuide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. But I am working on it as I'm filming this lesson, so if it's available, a link will pop up on the screen that will allow you to download it. If no link appears, you can look in the description and it'll say whether it's available or coming soon. And if it's not available yet, you can sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a copy as soon as it is available. Also, if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive all updated versions as well. But don't worry, you don't need the eGuide to follow along with this lesson because all of the charts will be on the screen. And also be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day. This is part 4.2 from our series Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So now that you know how to build more chords off the first note of the major scale, which are 1 chords, I'm going to show you some practical ways to play them on the fretboard. And I'm only going to show you some. I'm only starting with ones that start with the root on the 6th string. There's endless possibilities with a lot of these. I'm going to show you a lot of the common voicings that are used, but I'm not going to go over all the different string sets or different inversions or anything like that because that would be way too much for this lesson. This lesson is more just theory still. This is a theory series. And I have other lessons that show how to play chords. I have a whole bunch on beginner chords, so if you're still a beginner playing open chords, I have a whole bunch of lessons on that, on how to play different beginner chords, as well as a free eGuide that corresponds to those lessons, which shows all the diagrams, plus shows you chord progressions and how to put them together in a nice chord progression. So if you're still a beginner, still playing open chords, that would be a really useful eGuide to get. And I also have one that I'm working on right now that's going to be intermediate and advanced chords, which will have a lot of the type of chords that I'm going to show you in this lesson. And it'll show you just a ton of different options for ways to play them. And you'll be able to pick and choose which ones work best for you or sound the best to you. And another good option that you can do is take the information that I'm giving you and start your own chord dictionary. So you can just start taking the information, this theory, and start writing out your own chords, finding ones that fit the best with your hands, what feel the best to you, and what sound the best to you. And you can end up just writing a whole dictionary of chords on your own that you'll be able to use as long as you play guitar. And like I said, I'm giving you the theory behind it now, which will give you the ability to do that. So I'm going to show all these chords in the key of C. As you can see on your screen, this is a C major scale on the whole fretboard. So all the chords that I'm going to show you are just using these intervals. And the first one we'll start with is just a basic bar chord. This is an E-shaped bar chord, and if you've learned bar chords, this is one of the first that you would learn. So all it is a root, a 3, and a 5 doubled up. And that's a C major chord, and this is a C major bar chord. And if we were to go back to the C major scale, you'd be able to see those intervals, those notes, right here. This is where it lands within the whole C major scale. So I just want to be really clear that all these fingers that I'm showing you are just going to be these intervals right here on your fretboard. And then this would transfer to any key, just knowing where your root notes are. So that's a basic triad bar chord, a C major. Then if you wanted to make this into a major 7th, all you'd have to do is take this root, drop it back half a step to the major 7th, and then you'd have a C major 7. And this is a really full sounding C major 7 using all the strings. But if you notice, if you take this note out and this note out, this right here is a drop 2 C major 7th in root position starting on the 6th string that we covered in a previous lesson. Or you could take this 5th out and this root out, then you have the drop 3 C major 7 that we covered. So you can see how just by taking that C major bar chord, dropping the first octave root back half a step to the 7th, you're able to get a C major 7, and then you're able to see how the drop 2 and the drop 3 fall within that. And I want to go back to the C major bar chord for a second. One thing I want to point out As I mentioned in the last lesson and other lessons, when you talk about upper extension intervals, when we're talking about the 9, the 11, and the 13, those are the most important for right now. I mentioned that they're interchangeable in a practical sense with the 2, the 4, and the 6. That a lot of times you're not actually playing the actual interval name that you're holding. It might be a different octave from that. For example, you might be holding a 13 and calling it a 6. And I just want to point out with this C major bar chord, this third right here is actually a 10th. But you would never call that a 10th because it's very important to have a third in a chord to understand what's going on. But this interval from here to here is actually a 10th. From here to here, this root is actually a third. Or this 5 right here is an octave higher than this 5, and this 5 is actually a perfect fifth from this root, but this 5 down here towards the floor, if you're holding your guitar from this root, is actually a 12th. But in practical purposes, you're not going to call this a 12, you're not going to call this a 10, you're just going to call it 3s and 5s. So I just want to point that out, that that's why a lot of times those intervals are used interchangeably. That just works out in a practical sense. So don't get too hung up on, well, is this a 13 or is this a 6? I'm going to give you some help with that, but it's not that critical in most situations. So now if we go back to the major 7th, if we take away the 5 and the extra root, the 2 5s and the extra root, we just end up with a C major shell voicing, C major 7 shell voicing, which you'll remember from a previous lesson. And I just want to show you some things to make it easy to visualize other chords from this shell voicing. For example, if you add the 5th right here, you end up with that drop 2 C major 7 again. Or if you move it down to here towards the floor, higher up in octave, you end up with the drop 3 voicing. Or if we go back to the shell voicing again, if we take this 7 and move it back a whole step to the 6th, now we have a C major 6 shell voicing, just a C6 shell voicing, which is another common shell voicing. I just didn't show you before because we were talking about 7th chords. And then from here you could add the 5th right here and just have a C major 6. So now you have all the intervals of a C major 6, so it's not a shell voicing anymore. Or you could move the 5th up an octave and have another voicing of the C major 6, or C6 as it's called. Or if we go back to C major 7 shell voicing, if we take this 7 and move it up a minor third this time, so 3 frets, that would be a 9. Now we have a C add 9, just without the 5th. Or you could add the 5th in on the 5th string, or you could move this 9th up to the 1st string, and that's another C add 9 still. And again, here's another spot where this isn't technically a 9th, it's an octave over the 9th when you're talking about this being your root. But you would still just call that a 9. So this is a C add 9 chord. And another voicing option you can do is to move the 3rd to here, the 9th to here, and the 5th up to here. There's another voicing for the C add 9. Or if you added in the 6th right here, then you'd have a C6 add 9. Or if we go back to that C major 7 shell voicing again, if we add the 9th up here again with this shell voicing, then we have a C major 9 this time because we have the root, the 3, the 7th, and the 9th. We just left out the 5th, but as you remember, the 5th is the first one you can leave out, and it doesn't really affect the chord very much at all. Or you could move your 3rd and 9th to here, and that's another C major 9 voicing. Or you could add in the 5th on the 2nd string, and now you have all the intervals of a C major 9. You're not omitting any of them. Or another common voicing, you can actually take out the 3rd. Even though the 3rd is a really important interval in a chord to tell you what type of chord it is, sometimes important intervals are left out, and then it's just implied that this is a C major 9 chord, because that's the situation you're using it in. But technically a C major 9 has to have a 3rd in it. Or if we go back to the C major 9 right here that we got from adding the 9th to the shell voicing, we could add the 13th right here and end up with a C major 13th. Now we have the 3, the 7, the 9, and the 13 in there. So that's a major 13th. We've just left out the 5th again. Or we could move the 3 and the 9 to here and it'd still be a major 13, just a different voicing. Or if we wanted a really full C major 13 with all the intervals in it, we could move the 13 to the 4th string and the 7th to the 1st string and then add our 5th back in. And this is a really full voicing. You're using every single string. But it has every interval of a C major 13 in it. It has the root, the 3, the 5, which is your major triad, then the 7th, which equals your major 7th, then the 9th, which equals your major 9th, and then the 13th, which then makes it a major 13th. And some things I want to point out, that if you have a 6 in the chord and it's just a basic major triad adding the 6 in, you would call it a C major 6 or a C6. You wouldn't call it a 13. Because for it to be a C major 13, it has to have the 7th and the 9th in it. And you wouldn't call it just a C13 because that implies a dominant chord. So if you're adding the 6 to the major triad, it's a C major 6 or just a C6. And then if you add the 9th to a major triad, it's just an add 9, because for it to be a major 9, it would need the 7th in it. So if you're just adding the 9 to a major triad, it's an add 9. If it has the 7 and the 9, it's a major 9. And then again, the 5th is the first note that you can omit from a chord without changing the sound very much. The second note is actually the root. It's not necessary to play the root. A lot of people don't when they're comping along with other people, especially when you have a bassist going or a piano or something. They're playing the root a lot of times, so you don't have to. And the 3 and the 7 are the two most important intervals in a chord to really tell you what the intervals are. And a lot of people will just comp sometimes with the 3 and the 7 and leave everything else out, because that'll tell you whether it's a minor or a major 3rd, a minor or a major 7th. That's going to tell you pretty much everything you need to know within that chord. So if you're playing with other musicians, sometimes all you need is the 3 and the 7. But like I said, sometimes the 3rd is left out, just depending, and it's implied that it's in there. So there's not any very hard rules with a lot of this stuff. You just have to see what works best in each situation. And we'll cover this more and more as we go through these lessons, but I just want to point those out early on because you'll run across chords that leave out certain intervals. And another thing you'll run across, for example, with like a C major 13th, the 9th might be left out. And technically that would be a C major 7 add 13 or a C major 7 add 6, but a lot of players will just call it a C major 13 because that's what they're implying. They're implying that the 9th is in there. So you're going to run across a lot of different situations with different intervals left out and different ways that the chord is actually spelled out. And it's not necessary to get super technical with the names a lot of times, because if you say C major 13, sometimes that's easier than saying a C major 7 add 6 or a C major 7 add 13. And it's up to the player to decide whether the voicing they use has the 9 or whatever. So that's something we'll learn more and more as we go, but I just want to point some of this out now. So those are some fingering options for the chords that I showed you for the one chord. Again, download those chord eGuides I mentioned earlier on, the beginning chords and chord progressions eGuide and the intermediate and advanced chords eGuide. Those are going to have a way more options, going to show you on all the different string sets. You'll be able to use that as a reference for years to come. Or like I said, just start your own chord dictionary and start coming up with your own voicings and what you like. I just wanted to use this lesson to point out different options for building different chords and some of the different rules that you can use or break, and how in a practical sense the 6 and 13 are the same and the 2 and the 9 a lot of times, or the 11 and the 4. Like I said, we'll dive more and more into this as we go through the lessons. I just wanted to touch on it now. So go ahead and move on to the next lesson where I'm going to show you more options for building chords off the 2 of the major scale. So there'll be 2 chords this time. And download the eGuide for this, the Music Theory for Guitar. Has all these diagrams in it, be really useful to you. And be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.